the ultimate commandment from the divine, or urging from the divine, is to engage in a life of repair. And in that way we can repair the divine, and that way we can bring repair to each other. And maybe ultimately, if this can redound to the benefit of the entire world. So I was talking with a young Orthodox man recently, and I shared with him this was my theology. And he said, I don't understand. If you're not an Orthodox Jew, how can you believe in Lurianic Kabbalah? And here's the basis of his question. Luriana, I think obvious, Luriana lived from 1534 to 1572, so it's quite Orthodox, what we would call Orthodox. And his belief was that every one of the mitzvahs that he practiced, that was part of the system of mitzvot in his day, each one was another way of repairing the divine brokenness. So if for example, if a man puts on tefillin, a woman lights Shabbos candles, then all the other mitzvahs, each one of them done with the proper kavanah, the proper intentionality, which means you can't do it mindlessly. You have to link mind, soul, heart into the mitzvah, and all this together, as it were, sends up an energy that heals the divine, and then the divine sends down an energy. This is called la'ela, energy going up, and latata, energy going down. So there's a symbiotic connection between us and the divine. But it's very much rooted in the traditional prayer book, is rooted in the traditional system of mitzvot, and that every one of these that you practice has to be done with not just kavanah, intentionality, but Luria actually wrote little meditations for each one. And he says, well, if you're really a Lurianic Kabbalist, why aren't you Orthodox? And then he shared with me, he says, one of the reasons I'm Orthodox is because of Lurianic Kabbalah. I said, okay, well, I said, do you want the 1-minute answer, the 5-minute answer, or the real answer, right? Which is one of my pedagogic techniques. I want to actually know, is it a rhetorical question, meaning you can't actually be? Sometimes, when people ask a question, they don't really want to ask a question, they're trying to make a point. The rhetorical interrogative, as it were. So he said, no, I want an answer. And I said, I don't have time now, let's make a time. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell him, all right? So this is a critical thing for all of us who are spiritual, I think, and in this congregation, at least this is you might say, what shapes this community, shaped by Hasidic spirituality, but non-Orthodox, or post-Orthodox, if you want to call it that way. Meaning, it's not non in the sense that we're against Orthodoxy, but Orthodoxy is a basis, and we have, as it were, used that as one of our foundations and have moved beyond it. So I would say, I don't like saying non-Orthodox, it sounds like a point of departure, but rather post-Orthodox means something that was essential in our journey to where we are now. As you know, Hasidic Judaism took all the great formality of Lurianic Kabbalah, all these complex meditations, and tried to move the meditations off and return us to the idea that every one of these urgings from the divine requires personal volition and concentration and intentionality to understand what you're doing, to understand the dimensions of the mitzvah, and understand its symbolic dimensions. So even in Hasidic Lurianism, and I put myself in that world, it requires someone to be Orthodox. So that's why when you run into a Chabad rabbi who's in the mitzvah mobile, or you find him somewhere, and they say, "Oh, woman, light candles, man, put on tefillin." Now, why is that? It's a very deep redemptive thing, because they believe that if you're right-handed, the left arm of a man is unfulfilled if it doesn't have tefillin on its arm every weekday. Meaning it's like one of your limbs is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. If a woman around sunset is not lighting candles, there's something in her being that is unfulfilled. So they see the full realization of every Israelite to be fulfilled in the observance of this mitzvah. And if you don't do it, you're hurting your soul. And if you hurt your soul, you hurt God's soul, and you postpone the redemption. So when they come to you and they say, put on tefillin, they're not just trying to be bossy. They're not just trying to get another secular Jew to do mitzvahs. They're trying to save your soul and to save God. There's a very strong redemptive salvific dimension, both at the human and the divine level. So where do I depart from this? Because the assumption of orthodoxy is, the mitzvot are from God. Right? Seems to be the assumption. And many people get swept up into this. And so sometimes when a person says tefillin, I say, well, show me where tefillin's in the Torah. So it says, it shall be a sign upon your hand and frontlet between your eyes. We read it every day. So they say, okay, that's tefillin. I said, show me. It doesn't say, put leather straps on your arm with a box on your bicep, and in the box will be these, oh, that's the oral law. So there's an understanding in Orthodoxy that in addition to a written law, there's an oral law, which the Torah does not seem to suppose. And you would think that if there were such an active oral law, the literature after the Torah, meaning Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, Job, the 5 Megillot, Daniel, Ezra, somebody would mention it, right? One would think, right? It's not there. I've read the Bible cover to cover. Cannot find it. Okay? It does talk about the Torah of Moses. It never mentions the oral law. Now, I'm not against the oral law, but I do not accept what I would call, the rabbinic theory that there was an oral law delivered side by side to the written law at Mount Sinai. I just don't believe it. And it's when people say, I say, demonstrate it to me. Here's the Bible, show me. Show me in the Bible where it says that, because people were living for 1,000 years after the Torah was given, and it's never mentioned once. They say, okay, you're right. But in the Talmud it says it's mentioned. I said, well, that's called begging the question. Which means, how do we justify? We justify the Talmud because there's an oral law. How do we know there's an oral law? Look in the Talmud. So that's called, I'm proving my point by assuming something that is not, the exact thing we're trying to prove, which is called begging the question. So once I say, again, this is foundational of liberal Judaism, that what we would call the Jewish tradition is evolutionary and developmental, and that I can prove from the sources, meaning I can show you source after source after source where you see the law changes, it evolves, it develops. That is very clear. It's much harder to prove that the oral law came from the mind of God like Athena jumping out of the head of Zeus and suddenly comes into the world in full form. You cannot demonstrate that. You can demonstrate easily the evolutionary developmental dimension of the law. Now, I understand why people want to say the law is straight from God, because when you don't, you have a critical problem of authority. If it's not straight from God, it evolves over time. There's all these disparate voices. What are we supposed to do? And that is an existential crisis for people when they say there's no standard. If there's no standard, we don't understand what God, we believe in God, we believe God communicates to us, but we don't know exactly what to do. So, I think that that idea saves one from the critical question is, what do we do? Which we in liberal Judaism have to face. Now, so once I believe that the halakha evolves and develops, and it is still evolving and developing today, what I've tried to do is break down the dimensions of halakha into a few different levels. So, for example, what I call the sanctification of the mind, which is study, which is actually kind of unique to the Jewish people in a way. You look at other religions, there's demands for meditation in some, there are demands for recitation in some, but the idea originally that every male should be educated in the system, and then I think in today's time every female as well, meaning we should be intellectually competent in the sources. This is a really interesting idea, that the sources, you should have mastery of the text. It's almost like, when the English were teaching the great canon, they had this idea that if you master the classics, it will humanize you as a human being. So a lot of English schoolboys were breaking their head on Latin and Greek, and why? Because this will educate you. It's just an understanding. You need to know this to be a gentleman. You need to know this to participate in our world. Now, we've had that idea, I think, certainly since rabbinic times. If the mind is going to get shaped anyway by something, so shape it like this. Shape it with these narratives and this law and this way of thinking, so your mind is not shaped willy-nilly by whatever you find out there. So this idea, what I call sanctification of mind. Certainly the sanctification of the inner life through the life of prayer, and the sanctification of time through our calendar. So my understanding is not that the divine delineates specificity, but rather, in the covenant of God and Israel, the divine has, you might say, ordained arenas of mitzvot, and that you might say every community has to figure out its own way.